So what we're going to do is give each group 5 minutes to report out. And I'm assuming you have already anointed a spokesperson, or everybody will look at somebody and they will volunteer. So the outcomes should be presented. Tell us just a little bit about the process that you used, because I think there were different approaches in terms to how this was handled. I saw some formal methods and I saw some informal methods to handle this. So tell us a little bit about how you arrived at the solutions. I've said provide 2 requests that you fulfilled, just to give us a sense of the diversity of topics that came up. So you could actually make a broad statement about the types of topics that came up and then maybe speak to two of them, and where the fulfillment of the request came. You know, how many people were actually involved in sharing networks or recommendations. And then finally, any observations you have, learnings from your group's experience. So it's pretty open-ended, and it's all an opportunity for us to share and learn together. So the question is, which group would like to go first? Oh, I love that. Let's give them a round of applause. And Kathy, does that mean you're the spokesperson?
It does, and it means I want to get it over with.
Here you go.
All right, so we kind of had 4 help requests come to the table, and really the first one everybody coalesced around, and it was really around diversification of revenue and business models, mainly around the non-dues revenue piece. And one of the biggest things that I think a tip came out was ASAE now has a tool that's online for operational ratios, and you can determine whether there's an unhealthy reliance on revenue from either journals or membership dues or whatever, to see if your organization is out of balance on one thing or the other. And you can use that information to decide if you need to diversify your income or your revenue. But we talked a lot about diversification, whether it's distance learning, whether it is affinity programs, whether it's coming together and collaborating, small organizations collaborating and partnering together, and really making the most use of like hotel contracts and things like that, so that not everybody's trying to go it on their own. And we had some lessons learned. Be careful of offering stuff free at the first and then trying to charge for it later. People get really ticked off at that. And think about the price point at the offer, making sure it's market-based and not just what your member wants to pay, because you don't always need to be the lowest price model out there, or your member doesn't always know what the market is. And then some of these things tend to get eliminated during recessions or down periods, and make sure that you don't staff up and that you get caught flat-footed during those downturns, and be thinking about that as you go through. Then we also talked a little bit about our boards wanting some of the smaller associations to go after things like grants. And grants are not always worth what it takes to get them. So you have to figure out what your price point is and what the administration you need to get that grant. So a lot of folks have to put on a full-time person to do all the paperwork with the grants, versus some of the other grants just require a one-pager. So there's some resources in the room. June at AICHE, obviously, according yesterday, was really successful at a grant. She's staffing up to do that. Norman, I know you've had a lot of experience with grants. Wendy, there's a United Engineering Foundation grant process, which is a very shortened grant process. So this is a good group to ask for resources around that. But be careful of grants, because sometimes they're more trouble than they're worth. Also, some associations are really good at using grant writing as a micro-volunteering effort. So if you have a grant that has really specific expectations around it, you can use your volunteers to write those grants for you as long as you lay out those expectations. So you don't always necessarily need to staff up to write those. We had a pretty specific problem with open access when it comes to journal publications. In that somebody had a contract that was coming up with their publisher, and they had, and I'm sure nobody else has this, but a zealot as a volunteer who wanted to go totally open access, but yet publications were 95% of their revenue. So, the challenge of trying to predict the future of publishing and the timing of what your new contracts need to be, what's that daylight, 5 years or 10 years, or long enough so that you can retire and it's the next person's problem. So things like that. But one of the best suggestions through this group, find out if there's an RFP process or a consultant that can help you through that RFP process that probably knows that landscape better than you do, and that can help you oversee the RFP process and think about all the ramifications of that process. And it was felt by a couple of people at our table that that overseer of the process was well worth the money and helped them save a lot of money in the long term. And then the last thing was just miscellaneous stuff. Our core mission really is what we do. And for other things like building maintenance or stuff that's not core to our mission, the key to that is really hiring consultants to do that and not trying to do it ourselves. And chances are we've all hired a consultant for one thing or another, and if something like that is needed, throw that need out on the listserv, because somebody in this room has probably done it.
Kathy, thanks for that report out. A question. You're not going to get rid of the mic that easy. Could you tell us a little bit about the way in which this exchange unfolded? So, for instance, in terms of everyone at the table submitting ideas, how did that happen, and how did you go through the list? Did it evolve? Did you deal with things serially, or did it evolve into more of an open exchange? How did the process work at your table?
Somebody threw out a need, and everybody just kind of contributed. It was a pretty free-flowing conversation. Mm-hmm. And then honestly, you said we're halfway there, and we all said, we all like number one. Let's pile on top of that one. So, I think we all kind of, threw out the issues, and we kind of evolved into these groups and kind of fleshed those out more.
So everybody at the table feels like they got something to walk away with. Did you get more than one thing to walk away with?
I think so.
Right. Great. Give them a hand, please. Who's next? Pat.
I'll move over here just so that I'm behind everybody. So, we had a very robust and stimulating discussion. I think it flowed very naturally. We did go around the table and everybody got an opportunity to talk about their particular issues and challenges. We started with a discussion having to do with a board perk in providing the executive with an opportunity for executive education, say a 5-week extended course. And while the CEO would like to take advantage of that, you worry about the other ramifications, and can we really afford to be away from the job for an extended period of time? How will the rest of staff perceive that, and so forth. So we looked at that from different perspectives and provided some alternatives maybe to take back and consider. We talked about succession planning and how that can impact the organization if you're small, large, what the expectations of the volunteers are, and working with the leadership to make sure you stay on the same path as you set out that plan to make sure that the organization has well-documented procedures and that you have a staffing plan for the future, whatever situation may arise. We talked about changing models and visions, and how sometimes we have a legacy staff that might have the tribal knowledge that is necessary, but might not necessarily be on board with that new vision. And is there a way to kind of reposition them to benefit from where their strength is, which is probably not what they think it may be, and you still utilize them in that capacity, but not be held back by the deficiencies that they may bring. We talked about purposeful abandonment and planned obsolescence, and as how we prepare our strategies for the future, we also have to look at the allocation of resources from today to make sure that we are putting the people and the money where the best return on investment is that aligns with that vision for the future. And then in my specific case, I had a territorial problem with a part of the world, and we talked about that, some of the background, and I intentionally did not lead the horse to water, meaning determine kind of where I was at with this. But very quickly, I think the group collectively came to the conclusion that I already had, which quite honestly was worth the price of admission to me, because now I can go back and continue the conversation with my board and reaffirm what I've already told them. And if I think about how much time and how many dollars that would have taken me to go get consultants or legal counsel or others, I just got a lot of great wisdom that was invaluable to me. So I'm very thankful for that. And maybe perhaps the biggest observation or revelation to us was that we found out that SAMPE is just a wonderfully well-run organization. Greg Balco has no issues, no challenges. And I think the quote was that they are a fine-tuned machine. So SAMPE is the group you should benchmark everything against.
Pat, same question that I asked Kathy. So how did this all unfold? How did the discussion come to pass? How did you collect the topics? And then how did the discourse take place?
Well, so my observation when I saw your list, I thought there's no way we're going to get through this, and we're never going to be able to have a meaningful discussion in that limited time. I don't think we were really that hard on keeping track and moving on every 8 minutes or so forth, but it was a very natural flow. And so we actually started at one point in the table and simply went around clockwise and didn't have to force the discussion. I think it was very natural. Points were pretty much quick and on the spot, and a lot of dialogue back and forth. So I was very impressed with how natural it seemed and how much progress we did make.
And everybody here got something out of it?
Awesome.
Are there any follow-up actions? This is a tough customer right here. This guy,
That change management, they were all different aspects. The change management, I guess, was kind of an underlying theme, whether it be personal progression, succession, abandonment, the whole. And so I think there was a collective wisdom at this table. We all had different experiences in our organizations at different times. So it was very productive, I think, for all of us collectively. And as Pat said, he can go home with some more confidence that he's not unique, alone. His thinking isn't completely obtuse to reality. So, absolutely.
Are there any, I'm just curious, any follow-up actions? Anybody said that they have to do something after the meeting?
Actually, several of us want to connect because of the experience or whatever the others had. So, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. Round of applause, please. Go to this side of the room.
Thank you.
Jackie?
Hello, I'm Jackie Eater Van Hook, for those of you whom I haven't met yet. I don't know who you would be, but... Okay, so we had a pretty free-flowing discussion. Folks volunteered their questions, and we just kind of just went with it. It was a little chaotic, but it worked for us. So we spent more time at the beginning and finished all but one of the questions. We had a mix of both CEOs, long-term CEOs, as well as newer and first-time CEOs, and some consultants and suppliers. We really focused on kind of 5 areas, it turns out. So governance, change, management as well as advocacy, and then a network thing. The ones that I want to talk about really are the governance issues. So we had 2 first-time execs that were talking about issues with their board and expectation setting. And I think that we got through some resolution on how to attend to the issues. I don't want to say too much more about it because I think they're both professional and they're personal, and so, well, enough of that. But they're really about how to set expectations. And one of the things that I thought was particularly helpful is that having diverse expertise by having the CEOs at different levels as well as the consultants at the table provided a rich, broad-based perspective. And it just reminds me how valuable that is just having different folks. So I think that's about what else.
Okay. And everybody got at least one thing out of it, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that with the giving that happens at the table, the return actually goes beyond just perhaps the one request that I as an individual submitted, and that we pick up other things just by also contributing. So, okay, a round of applause for this group. 2 left. You guys are going last. I'm coming over here to pick on this group. Robert?
I was sitting facing this way, and my dear colleagues behind me voted that I would be the presenter. Wonderful teamwork. Okay, so let's see what we can remember. So I just jotted down some very quick notes, having been informed that I'm the speaker. So we had a really great discussion. We filled every minute, filled the unforgiving minute. We did indeed sort of randomly go around the table with the various points coming up, and I think in 1 or 2 instances being triggered off each other. The 8 topics, very, very briefly, that we covered were things like the hiring of a general counsel, whether to or not to. The second topic we discussed was publishing and some of the challenges of open access and how to go about publishing, particularly perhaps from a small society. The third area we got into then was triggered off that, which was preprint servers and whether or not they're valuable. Speaking as a physicist, of having used preprint servers right since their inception 27 years ago, I know how valuable they are, and I know from both the UK Institute of Physics and the American Institute of Physics that we have benefited dramatically from preprint servers, particularly in our publishing operations over the years. I'm not going to talk any more about that. The fourth area we got into was staff warfare. A couple of important staff members, very important to the organization, both relatively new within 1 or 2 years of hire, clearly not getting on at all well, and how do you deal with the conflict situation and how is it going to resolve itself? I'll come back to that in a minute. We then talked about overwork in a small society. Society maybe of 5 or 6 people. The CEO clearly struggling with the sheer workload involved. Having to be the jack of all trades was the sort of impression that I got, maybe rightly or wrongly, and what you can do about it. We also touched on CEOs and where we go next. What do we do next after being CEO? Do we become chair of a board, or do we move to another organization? What's the career path for a CEO of a society member? And we also talked about a young person's situation, whether to get qualified at night school, how much do qualifications matter as you go through your career, perhaps against the experience that you pick up as you go through, and when you do it, and what do you not do. And then we also, the 8th topic we touched on was approval processes. And the difficulties perhaps of dealing with government organizations or whatever. Now, I've actually said enough there. The staff conflict, I'll just lay a couple of extra details on for you. Under the staff conflict, we definitely touched on the pain of having to replace good people. We touched on the loss of team morale, which I know from personal experience. I've dealt with a similar problem. I'm sure pretty much everybody in this room has dealt with this. If you've got a bad egg in the mix, the morale of your team can go down and your productivity can go down. You take the bad egg out and things can radically change. So we touched on that to some extent. The pain of having to part with a good employee in order to have the team perhaps be more effective in the past. I'm not going to say any more about the CEO career development activities. There are options. We touched on those. I would love actually to hear from many people here about how do we do career development as CEOs in the future. Maybe that's a topic for future CES discussion. The overwork thing, I think we all know about overwork and the time management that we have to put in the delegation and the coming up with clear plans and then delegating to the right people. The preprint servers, I've already said enough. So actually, I think it was a really valuable discussion. I think all of us actually learned a lot from each other, and we touched on some, I think, quite important topics.
So would you say that also similar to the other groups that you started out with a number of ideas being put on the table, but that it kind of evolved into more of a informal exchange, or did you handle the things serially? Serially. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you made it through every issue.
Yes.
And would you say every request was fulfilled?
Pretty
Are there
much,
follow-up
yeah,
actions?
yeah.
Did anybody have to say, or did anybody come up with, I know somebody and I'd like to connect you with them?
Yeah.
Great. That's excellent. So we had the network involved, we had experiences involved, we had knowledge sharing involved, and you actually went request by request.
Yeah, so I think there were two things which came out which we might pick up on future CES meetings. One was perhaps the way that we deal with government, the etiquette that is very useful. Maybe some societies don't have the experience of dealing with government. There are certain protocols and rules and regulations which you have to be very aware of in how you deal with people so you don't get blacklisted. We might actually have that as a kind of discussion. And then the second point was the one I alluded to, which is where do we as CEOs go for career development? What else can we do? There you go.
It's like the Grammy Awards, they're going to a commercial now. David, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to note that I shared some advice, and then a little later I was talking about my issue, and someone shared my advice back at me and said, "You should really do what you just said." So, that was helpful.
All right, give them a hand, please. Last but not least.
All right, I'm Seth, and so we just went around the table. I kept a timer going, and we went from person to person, and we finished up right on time, and we got to everybody, and we got an answer, actually a set of answers, I think, for everybody. We had one personal, and everything else was professional. By the time we got to the last person, they were a little bit hesitant, and the group said, "Come on, we're getting really good at this. In fact, we should just go outside and start attacking people and, giving them solutions to their problems." So, so that was kind of fun. I'll just give you a sampling of what we talked about. I won't go through it all. One was to develop and distribute educational materials on a large scale, a national initiative. I asked about a client who I have who's in a real pickle that could represent significant legal issues and dramatic revenue declines, and I was asking how I could best support that person. Someone said they wanted to do 50 random acts of kindness in 50 days, and they wanted them all to play forward, and they were worried about keeping themselves accountable for delivering that. Someone was talking about strategic planning and said they've got a board who's not. They're in the weeds, and how do we get them out? So that was a kind of a sampling of what we went through. What about observations? Someone else from our group want to make some observations about what it was like? Erica, I'm volunteering you. You can volunteer someone else.
Well, I mean, it's just as useful to hear what other people are going through. We had things like succession planning and strategic planning and the dilemma of, employee relations. I mean, it's all things that we all go through. So even when it was someone else's problem, it was valuable to hear the solutions, without a doubt.
So the same questions for the last group. Are there any follow-up actions that you're going to do with each other, or someone's going to send somebody something? And
Yes.
Was there any, you ought to talk to this person, somebody coming from your personal
Referrals.
and professional network?
Yeah, personal and professional networks, yeah.
Terrific. All right, well done. Give them a hand. Give everybody a hand. So on a more general, I get a very positive vibe that this worked, right? So why do we think it works so well for this group? What do you think are the underlying reasons as to why this works?
Well, right before the break, that chart you put up, I agree with your statement that I think the majority of us are givers.
Mm-hmm. That's one. And
I think there's a high degree of trust in the room.
yeah, trust. I mean, I think that's at the foundation of this.
And to Tom's point, I think it was good we did this at the end instead of at the beginning. I don't think we were warmed up yet. And hadn't built some relationships that are new or strengthened throughout the week.
So it's interesting in circumstances when this is done, oftentimes, depending on if it's being facilitated or self-run, there tends to be a warm-up, right, to try to get people engaged. So I think we've had, 2 days of warm-up before we got in here? Mark?
And I don't think it's a requirement, but I think it helps that we all have a lot of common experiences in our roles, and that really helps the process.
Yeah.
For me, it's an expectation. So I come to SES with those questions in mind, looking for those answers before I even get here. And of course, that's built up with experience, whether it be within the online community or past meetings. But that is the essence. That type of exercise, that type of sharing is my expectation of the value add of SES. And I think that made it, if it was a group that didn't have that already in place, it may not be as successful.
Any other comments? So I put up this slide. This is from Adam Grant's book. And I think it kind of pulls out the summary of the comments that were just made, which is successful givers, they get to the top without cutting others down. I mean, it's all about what we're giving to each other and to the people with whom we work. And at the foundation of that, as Tom pointed out, is trust, but also this notion about being bound by common experience. We all share, I actually would observe that the reason that we tended to default more to issues that were professional related to the work that we do is that was the common context that brings us together. And so I would ask you to think about that contextual, the notion of, here we go again. I gotta turn this thing off. Okay. To think about that context piece when you start thinking about using this or something similar to this in other environments, including your own organization. So, how do you think the dynamics of something like this would change? This community, we've been together for a long time, so the trust is actually deep-rooted. But in your organization, you might have two competing, we all deal with, my silo is better than your silo, and yet we're trying to get everybody to work seamlessly across. What would happen with this kind, what do you think? And there's no right answer or wrong answer to this. What do you think would happen if this approach is used when you have to bring people together from competing sides, or they perceive to be competing as opposed to collaborative sides?
I was going to come back with a question for you, Matt. The self-organization worked well in this room, right? That was my impression. If you take this back and do it in your own shop, would you recommend self-organization, or would you be more prescriptive in terms of designing the groups across departmental lines? What would you think about that?
So I would say that, first of all, if the question is what's the purpose, right? So if the purpose is to come up with a breakthrough product, I do think you have to be more prescriptive about who are the people in the room. I will tell you just from personal experience, we have wrestled with, in the 2 years I've been there, we had no product pipeline. We had no idea what was going to come out next year, and it made it very difficult to predict what was going to happen in terms of financial outcomes. And we had competing groups, literally competing groups, doing more finger pointing at the other groups as to why they weren't doing something than actually taking an action themselves. So I said I wanted to solve that problem, and I said the way we were going to do it is we were going to do it together. I'm not going to mandate anything, but let's put the smartest people we have who are all talking about this in a room. So we were very prescriptive about doing it, and we didn't quite use this process, but we used something that is very similar to it, and we did get to a great outcome. And a lot of that was because when you sit, no matter whether you're a taker or matcher, or a giver, at the end of the day, everybody is a giver in that circumstance, and a lot of what happens when people actually communicate with one another, they reach understanding, and they start to work together better. So I think, I would encourage you to look for opportunities to try these things. Yes?
Before we had this session, I had already taken a snapshot of the description of it and sent it to our program team for our conference, because each year we have a Senate meeting for the chapters, and we get all the chapter leadership together, and it usually turns into what headquarters hasn't done for them, this incredible list. And it's usually, we've been ticking off the list, but we've tried to flip that on what can we do together and how can you help advance the mission, but I think this format would work really well in them helping one another and creating that network that can then continue on after the event. Yeah.
And I'd be happy to talk to you about that, because we've had that direct experience, so just as a side. The other thing is going back to Jay's question and the experience that I share. This, again, what brought us together is contextual understanding. So what I see working, not just in my organization, but in others that I've talked to that are using similar approaches, is that when you contextualize the work that people are doing, when they really understand why they're doing it, they tend to contribute more. So again, it's just a personal example to share is that our organization is heavily involved in the area of cybersecurity, and in particular helping organizations determine whether they have the right cybersecurity programs in place to defend their organizations, and also to train the people who do that kind of work. Well, it turns out that of our 220 employees, probably 210 have no idea what that work is like. So we actually put in place a couple of lunch and learns where people who actually do the work, both inside the organization and outside the organization, came in and talked to the staff. And the staff minds, it was just amazing to watch the faces in the room, because suddenly they have context. They don't have to be experts in it, but if they have context of what they're working for, and they can glean from environments like this where they're sharing, they become extremely inspired, and they tend to contribute more. And so, the premise that comes out of Adam Grant's book is that, we're all givers, and our organizations, by their nature, is about giving. That we really should be working hard on creating a culture of givers, and that it's really fundamental to what we do. So I wanted to conclude on this, and I'm not really a self-promotion guy, but I am sharing about how we're measuring the results of these kinds of activities. We perform an annual employee engagement survey, and we work with Willis Towers Watson. Now, there are many organizations that do this thing, so there's no pitch here for Willis Towers Watson. It just happens to be something I'm comfortable with. And part of the reason that we use them is that I like their benchmarks. They have a lot. We learn about our organization in the context of others. But when we looked at the results this year, the one that is the most striking is the one about the 97% of respondents. Now, we had a 96% response rate to the employee survey, 220 employees. And 97% of the respondents are willing to put in extra effort beyond what is normally expected to help ISACA succeed. Culture of giving. At least that's the only way that I can interpret that. And so I think that there is there's a lot to glean from these types of interactions. And whether you use this, I forget who, I think it was Pat, I was saying that there are other things you can do, and I forget who the name of the person is, but there's this process of asking for 5-minute favors, where a small group of employees can get together, or could be any small group of anyone can get together and say, hey, I need 5 minutes of your time, can you help me address this issue? So with that, I don't know if there are any other observations or questions. David?
Well, just listening to this last bit, I realized we had a major international initiative. It took us several years, and one of the volunteer leaders we had leading it was a total taker. And he was a taker, primarily very transactional, and managing the strife and conflict that erupted around him on a constant basis really made the project hard. And I hadn't thought of framing it this way, but I think, especially in our societies, where you have someone leading a collaborative effort, they have to be a giver. They have to be, supporting everyone else and gaining their profile through that, rather than just being in it for themselves. It seems obvious, but it seems like an interesting lens to use when you're looking at who to select for these things.
Matt, just to amplify one point, and thank you for being our spokesperson. Melanie shared the difficulties that they're running through, and it's not new. If I understood, it's going on for some time. But from an approval standpoint, for funding, activities, and a lot of it may be optics, but you could justify why a group of 40 folks were taken out for hockey and beer and so on. But someone on the outside looks at it and say, well, that's just a boondoggle. And we appreciate in the CES community that is important, it's valuable, and so not quite clear what all we do with it, but I pledge to work a little bit that it seems like we'd want to be as supportive as we can to say, yep, we recognize that an outsider would see this differently, but it's important.
I wanted to ask you, Matt, about the engagement survey. We just did it, as I was telling you yesterday, for our organization. We have the results in 2 weeks. So the way I used it is sort of benchmarking at the beginning of my tenure, and then see how if we move the needle in the right direction or not. So, question for you is: have you done this already? Is it the first time you do it? And if not, have you seen any changes? And how do you look at it? If you said it, I missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, good question. I'm happy to share. This is the third time. I did it immediately when I came in at the end of 2014. Did it again in 15, did it in 16. So the culture of giving was really part of, and I'm putting that, I didn't call it that. So I want to be clear that that's not what we called it, but it was about a dramatic change after where the previous environment was all decisions went to the top, and the new environment was we all work together and everybody contributes. So that number on the left column actually, the survey was actually done after I had been there for 4 months. So it actually came back very high. It came back somewhere around 93%. A lot shaped by the open-ended comments suggested that they had already felt the change. But that number has been going up. The second column, under the context of the work, was somewhere in the 70s and is now at that 90% level. So that's grown significantly. Also that's because there's greater clarity of where we're going in the organization. The organization had a strategy, but it was literally so broad. It was, I was telling Seth, there was a clear case of if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And we brought more clarity to it, which also helped give more context to the work. Benefits has always been a strong thing, so that hasn't changed very much. But the better way to serve customers, that was in the 60s. So that, again, is also bringing everybody together with understanding who we serve and why. And that, I would still like to see that go higher. We don't use this, though, as a report card, per se. It's more information, and that it's positioned also that as an employee collective, we as employees get to set the expectations for the place in which we work. So this isn't the executive team is not evaluated on this outcome or any of the granularity related to that. It's more that we actually engage the below the director level to actually serve as the spokespeople for the organization and come together and make recommendations on things we can do to improve. Anything else? Well, I hope you found this valuable. If you'd like this slide deck, let me know, and just slip me your card or send me an email, and I'll be happy to share that with you. And I felt privileged to be able to share this with you, and I look forward to continuing our relationship next year.